Hi guys, and welcome to our first lecture. It's just the introductory lecture, so we're going to kind of orient ourselves to what we're about, and welcome back to our virtual Ohio State, for those of you, a lot of us not on campus at all. I got 4 classes a semester. I'm not on campus for any of them. Kind of my choice in that regard. So let's talk about psychology of emotion and why study emotion. And right off the bat, what we can, determine as importance of studying emotion is that we come to learn more about ourselves. So it is in part the story of you. If you want the full story of you, you should probably take psych of adjustment with me, because that's what it's designed for. But this is about ourselves and learning about our emotions. So it's in the context that's most important on how we understand ourselves. As long as emotion can override cognition, and that's kind of a scary thought, right? As represented as reason, emotion assumes primacy in our order study and subsequent explorations of an understanding. So we might want to think about ourselves as reasonable, rational human beings, but to what extent does emotion kind of hijack that process and lead us to things that maybe are less than reasonable or less than practical. A little quote here: I count him braver who overcomes his desires than him who conquers his enemies, for the hardest victory is over the self. And it's a fascinating thought by Aristotle, and we will be talking a bit more about Aristotle, because one thing that we have to understand is psychology grew out of philosophy. And if you look at my degree, my PhD from Ohio State, it doesn't say doctor of psychology, it says doctor of philosophy. And that's how arts and science views it, and that's kind of the historic roots that we are. So let's talk about the challenges in the study of understanding emotion. We have the shortcoming of language, and we're going to talk at the end of the course that if there's not a word to express it, is it possible to then feel it? And what is that relationship between language and emotion? Another thing that we have to consider is what's the relationship between cognition and emotion. And cognition, in this context, we're talking mostly thinking or reasoning, rather than the whole realm of cognitive processes that might include perception. But notice how emotion might affect perception. So it is kind of an altogether package, right, Penelope? So, feeling, what does feeling mean? And we got to get to that point, right? So we're going to go through a lot of definitions. There's no two ways about it. Moods. Are moods different than emotions? And by definition, yes, we have definitions that say they're different, and we'll explore how they're different. What about motivation, drive, urge? Where the hell does that fit with emotion? And I also teach psychomotivation. That's in the spring. Every spring we teach psychomotivation. And doing emotion and motivation, both my research areas, by the way, the line is fuzzy. And the more I learn, the fuzzier that boundary between motivation and emotion becomes, right? So where's the boundary? I don't know. And I become less certain on that over time, the more I think about it. Now, a question to ask now and ponder throughout the course. Are emotions a nexus of conditioning theory? So if we look at this from kind of a behavioral stance, to what extent are we conditioned to experience the emotions that we do, and maybe conditioned not to experience certain emotions in certain situations? How does that process work? So we can explore that, right? To what extent does the context, the environment, and the situation affect our emotional being, right? And there's a term I've been reading, a lot of existential philosophy, which led to existential psychology. Let's trace it maybe from 1910, 1920 through the 1960s. And the relationship of this idea, and Heidegger put this beautiful term, Dasein, which is obviously a German term because Heidegger was German, but it means being in the world. And I'm really kind of struggling, working with that concept of what is our being in the world, and how do we perceive it. So the environment, context, situation can be all important, especially to a social psychologist, right? To what extent, and let's blow it up then, to context as in culture, and to what extent does culture affect our emotional being? The intellect and cognition and its relationship, as we described on the previous slide, and then drives, motives, and needs. And these are our questions that we can ponder throughout the course. So let me ask you right off the bat, and a lot of the answers to these questions can come, feel free to talk about this stuff when we join each other for our Zoom session on Tuesdays, and also I'll have 3 sessions of office hours as spelled out in the syllabus, Zoom sessions. So we do have some virtual time together like that. So do any of us here have an emotional problem? And it's like, no, this is not analysis time. But as long as we're there, let's frame our efforts a bit, right? And if you like to journal, right? If you like to journal, then maybe you want to devote a portion of your journal or an entire journal to this course to kind of keep your thoughts, make them more real by committing them to paper, right, or electronic paper, if you will. But as long as they're here, let's frame our efforts a bit. Write down a couple of confusing, frustrating aspects of your experience with your own emotions and moods, right? Because those can be, if we think about it now, what happens is we're probably going to think about it right now, you're going to forget it, it's going to go into your non-conscious, and then there's going to be things that trigger little eruptions in the non-conscious that kind of answer some questions for you. That's kind of the way the mind works. And notice I use the term non-conscious probably more often than I will say unconscious. I'm a social psychologist, and social psychologists tend to prefer the term non-conscious to the Freudian term unconscious. But we'll give Freud plenty of his due later in the course. So let's hang on to those and use those same ideas as at the end of the course. Okay? And I want us to be practical, though, throughout this course as well. So we can be esoteric, we can be philosophic, all this great stuff. But also, what good is school if it's not training us to be in the real world, right, rather than maybe the mental world, if there is a separation between the two? Occupationally speaking, who might need to have a profound understanding of emotion to accomplish their goals? I mean, are you looking at that type of career, or are you looking at that type of job where that might become beneficial? Who might need to have the ability to arouse, suppress emotions in others? And, you know, that's kind of an interesting idea as well, right? Emotion may be a powerful tool when it comes to influence and persuasion. And we'll talk more about that. What might be the advantage to understanding emotion and associated implications and consequences in the workplace? That is, to what extent am I allowed emotional expression in the workplace? And one of the papers specifically kind of goes to that, especially for women, right? Relationally speaking, how might understanding emotion in oneself make one a more effective and a more desirable partner? And I think many of us want to be effective in our relationships. I know it's maybe a strange term, but we also want to increase our desirability to the other person. Unless we're looking to get the hell out of Dodge, right? How might understanding emotions in others make one more effective in relationships? And that is being able to process a partner's emotions, predict their emotions, create situations that, dare I say it, maybe control their emotional experience. And manipulation is a two-edged sword, right? So now think about it as a parent, and how many of you are considering parenthood as part of your life? And there's probably quite a few people that will go that direction. How might a deeper understanding of emotion help one to raise their child, if you choose to go one up? Right? How might a deeper understanding of emotion make it more difficult for one to raise their child? And I love pros and cons, because I say, wow, I have really, a huge emotion vocabulary. I understand emotions. I'm very sensitive to emotions. But will that make you more or less successful as a parent? And you can probably think of circumstances where it could go either way. And that's the essence of what we're trying to do here in the university, is ask you guys to leave here as better critical thinkers, better able to process pros and cons, this and that, right? I don't want to tell you what to think, but I sure as want to help learn people how to think more effectively so they can better achieve their goals in life by understanding that everything has pros and cons, points of view, right? What emotion lesson might you consider most important for your child to learn? These are very practical questions, right? Now let's flip it around, because we've been doing the parent thing, and point of view is if that's everything, right? As a child, so parent, child, right? Which lesson might you want to teach your parents about emotion as it relates to your upbringing? And as my mom, descended into dementia, started maybe 5-6 years ago. She died last November. As she descended into dementia, we started spending more time with her, and eventually we moved her out here from California so she could be in the memory care unit. So my wife and I were visiting her on the order of once a day, one or the other of us, and it was good times. I mean, it's hard to see her deteriorate mentally, but there was a lot of conversation still to be had and a lot of ground to cover about the past, and an awful lot of time to reflect on how I was my mother's son, and what that all meant, and how that all occurred. I'm not downplaying my dad, but my dad died 20 years ago, and they were divorced, so I spent much more time with my mother than I did with my father. Loved both, don't get me wrong on that, right? As an adult child, what about emotion might you want to express about your continued and future parent-child relationship? And you guys are probably at the age now where you're seeing a huge transformation, perhaps, in the relationship you have with your parents. What does that mean emotionally for both of you? And how do you intend to manage that, right? So I really want us to become more conscious of what our emotions are, how we use them, and what they mean to us. Now, enough of the heavy stuff. Let's lighten it up a little bit, huh? So this is Laura Hicks, and Laura is a portraits, wedding, macro photographer from Cincinnati, Ohio, right? Throughout her career, she had the privilege of photographing hundreds of weddings, thousands of portrait sessions, and being the official photographer for Extreme Makeover edition filmed in Westchester, Ohio. Here is photography is one of my hobbies, right? I've got this on my tripod, my camera's there, the wireless mic, the iPad now controls the camera. Frickin' technology is crazy, right? The computer's hooked up to all this shit. But when we talk about photography, and I was been into photography ever since I was, probably in middle school and junior high. Photography to me presents a special human capability of freezing time. That is, a photograph can take what's happening, it can freeze it at that moment, and it allows us to view something for an extended period of time, and that's not possible in the real world without photography, right? To sit there and analyze that slice of time. It's an instant, it could be a 60th of a second typically, but it's an instant in time that we can then play with and seek to understand. So for photographers and those interested in emotion, right? This is from Laura Hicks. I love to set my aperture for the widest available and focus on the eyes. I watch for their eyes to reveal what they're feeling. Right? Some of my favorite images are ones where the animal is sharing what we commonly experience as human emotions, right? Like a bug showing curiosity or a bird acting aloof, right? A mother gorilla embracing her child, or bonobo monkeys clowning around in front of the crowd. And you can see her sensitivity, Laura's sensitivity, probably makes her a very good portrait photographer and a very good wedding photographer, because she focuses on the eyes and she thinks about the emotion, capturing the emotion and creating an image that conveys the emotion. Right? In addition to knowing the animal's most active times, it's also important to anticipate movement of the animals. Watching their body language will also give you indicators so as to what they may do next. Is the animal alert, agitated, right? Is it showing off? Is it calm? Each emotion will result in a different type of image. So, and we'll talk more about photography as how it's important in the study of emotion. Here's an example of Laura Hicks' work. And she waited, and at the proper time, she got the image. Right? So, is the study of emotion possible without photography? Is it? What do you think? Photography yields this unrealistic outcome, as I was saying. It freezes time, and it can, at least for a perceptual awareness, suspend the fourth dimension. And one thing that I want to talk about in this class over and over and over again is the fourth dimension, because we talk about space, as having the three dimensions, but space changes over time, and I think in our thinking that the fourth dimension, time, is the most neglected in our thinking, but perhaps the most important. I'm not the same person I was 20 years ago or 20 years before that, and I don't want to go any further than that, because then I start sounding really effing ancient, right? So, but time matters, right? So this is critical to the study of the moment. A moment can be studied for that indefinite period of time. It can be returned to from different perspectives and possibly reflect new information. That is, I can learn more and look at a photograph and its meaning may change. Or I may look at a photograph, let's say I just broke up, right? And so my ex-partner, I just broke up, and I look and there's a whole batch of emotions that are evoked from that photograph. But then I look at it again 10 years later, and the emotions and what I read as emotions in that might be very different. Right? Time, the fourth dimension, all important. But pros, cons. Right? Take a moment to write down a few potential cons of a photograph, right? And this might go in your journal again. Now, normally in a classroom session, then we would go ahead and we would share these with our neighbors. That's not something we're going to be able to do under our current circumstances. But we'll get by one way or another. We'll adapt, right? So, let's talk a little bit about emotion then. It's relatively new. Not until the 19th century and the birth of psychology as a science did the term emotion even gain any kind of traction. Before that, there were all kinds of terms, and we'll discuss those throughout the course, but emotion really wasn't accepted or solidified on that. Hi, Penelope. You came back. What have you been up to? She's a constant lecture companion. She really likes this for some reason. I don't know why, right? Now, Hume used the conceptualization of philosophical psychology, the blending of the two, that transition point, but he tended to use the words passion and affects, which are still in existence, right, but not emotion. So in writings prior to the 19th century, you're going to read about passions, affections, appetites, all as maybe subcomponents or styles of emotions, with emotions being a slightly broader term. Okay. So, these conceptualizations have evolved a tremendous amount over time. So, what does this imply? If our relationship to our emotions was maybe different in the past, what does it imply for their evolution into the future? Is it possible that an increased understanding of emotion might have the potential to alter, evolve our emotions? That is, if we come to understand them, do we then gain more power over them, or power to use them, if you will? But and this is experientially, relationally, certainly intellectually. We've done a lot with emotions over the past 100 years, right? We've made lists, we've defined, we can detect all this good stuff. But to what extent has that been a helpful tool for us? And something that we can ask as we go through the course. Now, we can't ever deny or ignore evolutionary psychology. That genie is now out of the bottle. So a functionalist perspective often comes from DNA, and that is, what is the relationship of DNA to our emotions, or our ability to experience emotions, express emotions, etc.? Is emotion an artifact of our DNA that might be best sidelined, ignored to facilitate future interactions in an ever-decreasing life space as the population increases and we become more and more compacted, greater and greater numbers of us? Will emotions serve us well, or will they serve us poorly, right? Are people who can inhibit their emotional experience destined to be more successful and adaptable, and those who can't, less successful, right? What's going to happen with that? And we can't know, but it's a wonderful thing to watch and consider. Do collectivism and individualism cause different relationships to our emotions? And at first blush, my previous example, most collectivist cultures are slightly better at inhibiting their public display of emotions, right? I think it makes living in tight spaces perhaps a little easier. But that's just one example, and counterpoints can be made, right? Yeah. Thank you for that, sweetie. So, from Andrew Young. right? When asked about the evolution of protest, like especially nonviolent protest, as was espoused by Gandhi, by Dr. King, right? You know, they were killed by their inability to turn down their emotions and turn up their mind and intellect. And so Andrew Young is making a case for reason over emotion necessarily. But without emotion, who is likely to get out and protest in the first place? So it makes for an interesting kind of dichotomy that emotion might drive us to protest when we feel injustice has been brought against us or a group of people. Right? But at the same time, in emotional confrontation, as we witnessed countless videos of over the last couple months, to be able to turn down the emotions might be of benefit as well. So they might motivate, but at the same time, then they might cause conflict. When do we ramp them up? When should we tamp them down necessarily? So, what about emotional intelligence? How many of you have heard the term emotional intelligence? This is certainly popular with Daniel Goleman's series of books, right? Does it exist? Solovey and Meyer kind of developed the construct, and they've got a lot of research. Does it exist? Yeah, probably. Is it measurable? Goleman will say yes. Mark Davis will say yes. We'll talk about all these guys throughout the course, right? But does it matter? And we're finding in organizational psychology, the study of emotion, that people are, who are emotionally intelligent are more likely to advance, are more likely to promote. It is kind of a basic overall finding. Are you able to differentiate those right, on the basis of their emotional intelligence? Can you call this person emotionally intelligent while this other person is less so? Are you able to detect that? Okay, we're going to have to stop here. I got about 20 minutes on the clock, and that means the camera is going to want to start a new video.